And we're going to have a look. So I'm just going to look at part 3 of this, this sort of demo project of a cafe. So we're going to write a program that asks the user for their order. We're going to allow the user to input multiple items and to specify quantities. When the order is complete, we'll print the order and print the total price. I'm going to add in here that we also can print profit for the cafe if we wanted to. So we're going to keep track of cost and price for each item. Okay. So here's an example of how our program would run. We ask, what would you like to order? We give them the list of things they could order. And then we can, we let them type Q to quit. We give them a way to stop being asked, so we don't ask them forever. They ask for what they want. We ask them how many they want. They tell us how many, and we ask them if there's anything else they want until they say they're done. And we do some input validation. So if they type something that's not on the list, then we tell them they've given us something that's not on the list, and we prompt them to enter something else or to quit. And then when it's done, we print their order and the total cost. Okay, so are those instructions, those requirements clear to everybody? Any questions about what we're providing there? Okay, so let's write some user stories. So the way, and I'm going to put them in backlog for the moment while we're coming up with them. Okay, so what I do is I like to give a prefix to my Trello cards, and so I'll say like user story 1, for example. And then when I write other Trello cards that are related to this particular user story, I can refer back to that. Or in my test plan, when I'm writing test cases, I can refer to this little label. Okay? Now you can do this however you want. I'm just telling you the way that I'm doing it, and then you can do it a different way. Okay? But what this allows is a way to link what's in your testing spreadsheet to what's in your Trello board, for example. If you were using a more sophisticated system like Jira, then everything that you create in Jira, which is analogous to a card in Trello, would have a number associated with it. It gets auto-generated. You create a new ticket. That ticket will be in a certain category, like it's a feature or it's a bug or it's a whatever it is, and it would get us, and it's for this particular part of the product or that particular part of the product, this release or that release. And based on all that information, there would be a ticket number generated, and you would be able to reference that ticket number and everything else that you do. But Trello is not that sophisticated. There's probably some power-ups that give you similar functionality, I would guess. But since we only get one power-up with the free version, then we could, for example, add a custom field that says what the label is. So that's another way that we could do it, right? Or we could use a label. I'm just going to go ahead and put it in the title. I'm going to say user story 1. That's what this stands for. Maybe I'll put a dash in there. User story 1. So the way that you form a user story, it's always this template. It's as a something. So I'm going to say as a cafe, I can list the products on the menu. So that's one thing that I should be able to do. As the cafe. As a cafe, I can list the products on the menu. And, oops, I don't know what just happened there. Just like added a label out of nowhere with a keystroke. I don't know even how that happened. Okay, so I'm going to add another one. US2, as a cafe, I can ask the user for their order. And then I might add some description like ask the user for their order until they enter queue or quit to complete their order. So I might think about all the things that I can do as the cafe, all the things that my cafe app needs to do. So for example, as a cafe, I can print the I said user, but probably I should say customer, you know, either word. I can print the, I'm going to change that now. I'm going to say customer. As a cafe, I can print the customer's order and the total price. So let's think about some as a customer. As a customer, I can order any item on the menu and specify quantity. Let's see, do we need anything else, or is it mostly? So typically the way you do this is you come up with everything that you can think of, and then there might be things you think of later as you start to work on it. So I can also think of, as a cafe, I can print my total profit, because I said we were going to do that too. So as a cafe, I can print my total profit. And you look back at your requirements again and you see, okay, is there anything here that I haven't covered? So we could say, for example, as the cafe, I can print the total with 2 decimal places, because that would require something special, wouldn't it? We know that already as programmers, that requires doing something special. So I could add it as just an item on here, on this one about printing the total price. So I might say you could add it as a description, or you could add it as a checklist item. So let's create a checklist. Let's try this. So on this card, which actually involves a few things, doesn't it? I would have to print the list of items ordered with quantities, and I have to print the total price with 2 decimal places. So I'm just trying to capture all the information that I can capture right now about what I need to do to be able to satisfy the requirements. Now, if we go with these kind of user stories, I might also have things like so I've already got implement class methods. Oh, what happened to, I moved it to done. Never mind, let's move it back. I'm going to put it back here into do. So we have to define classes with attributes. We have to write a test plan. We're also going to have to, I might add something like execute. I don't know if I want to have a separate card for executing tests, because really as we develop each of these things, we should test them. So you work out, we'll think more about that tomorrow when we talk about writing the test plan. We'll think about how we're going to implement in our Trello board. Being accountable to actually testing all the things that we implement and how that's going to be reflected in this board. So we'll talk about that tomorrow. Okay, so listing, as a cafe, I can list the products on the menu. So you think about, what is that going to take implementation-wise to be able to do that? So it's going to assume that I already have classes with attributes defined, and I'm probably going to change this implement class methods to something else. So leave that for the moment. So if I have classes defined, so let's assume that that's done, and I want to list the products on the menu, that's going to be something like, you know, just basically a put statement, right? That's going to list, these are the things you can order, what would you like to order? But I'm going to have to be able to iterate through something to get that list of products, right? Or I can hard code it, one or the other, but either way, this is probably like a pretty small job. We can define over here on the left, we could have, or in backlog, we could have something that says, well, maybe we just want a different list. We could have, let me show you, if you create a list, and you want to move it to the left, you can just slide it over. So, estimate sizing. And an estimate sizing will say, it will say small is less than 1 hour to implement, medium is 1 to 2 hours, large is 2 to 4 hours, and then we'll say more than 4 hours, break it down into more cards. Probably on a 2-day project, we should break it down even less than that. So let's think about that. On a 2-day project, maybe we'll say large is, we'll just say 2 to 3 hours. More than 3 hours. Break it down into more cards. Okay, so listing products on the menu, I'm going to guess that that's small. Asking the user for their order, this one, asking the user for their order, this is also small, I'm going to say. Printing the customer's order and the total price. So to do that, we'll have asked them their order. It's really the work is in this loop, isn't it? Which is here. As a customer, I can order any item on the menu, specify any quantity, or, yeah. So this is what happens in the loop. And this is just what happens at the end of the loop. So what happens in the loop is probably a medium. And printing the order and the total price is probably a small. Order any item on the menu and specify quantity. Oh, what did I just do? This one should have been small. This one's medium. Now these are arbitrary, and sometimes you're wrong, okay? Sometimes your estimate is wrong, but you just kind of like make your best guess. And then if you find when you're working on it that this is actually taking longer than I thought it was going to take, then you change it. And then you talk to your team member and say, okay, we thought this was only going to take like an hour, but I've been working on it for an hour, and I think I still have at least another hour to go. Then you can decide together, okay, should you keep working on that? Are you stuck? Do you need my help? Is it something I should do? Do you want to work on something different? You have a conversation at that point, and you change the estimate if you need to. And then if you're working on a longer scale project, then you might decide to move it to another sprint, or you might decide that some other things that are in the sprint need to move out because this is taking longer than what we thought it would take. So that's why having things in a priority order becomes really important too. So let's have a look at the priority order. So these are the order that I thought of things as I was thinking of user stories, but it might not be the order that we need to do them in. So we definitely want to define classes and attributes. Then maybe a next step would be that we'd be able to list the products on the menu, because they can't order unless we can, be able to form a list of the products that they can pick. Then we can ask the user for their order. then the customer can order, and then I can print the total. Oh, here, maybe this one. I can print the customer's order and the total price, and then I can print my total profit. So those things sort of go in order. It makes sense that we would implement things in that order probably. So this one I'll probably still do something different with. So we'll see where that goes. So let's, now that we've got this worked out, let's try to define classes. So we're going to define, first subtask should probably be define which classes we need. And then I've assumed that those are the classes we're going to need, so we got there later. Okay, so let's define which classes we need. All right, so we have a customer, but the way we interact with that customer really is just to show them menu items, they order, we print the total, and then we're done. There isn't really a need for us to represent the customer in our system because we just interact with them for that one interaction, and then we're done interacting with them. If our app was extended and we could have multiple customers and we had to keep track of multiple people's orders in the same session, then we would need to represent a customer somehow. We'd have to know their name, maybe, and associate that name with a particular order. But that's not what the requirements say. The requirements indicate we're just interacting with a single customer. They can order from the menu, and then we tell them what the total is when they're done. So we don't really need to represent a customer as an object in this case, in my view. All right? So, but we do have, what's the big object that comes to mind for people that we have to deal with in this problem? What's the thing that we have to keep track of? Items and specific. Well, so we have items, but Jai, what were you going to say? So what else do we have? So we have items, which are like things on the menu. Yes. So prices would be a property of an item, wouldn't it? So if we think about the item, so let's consider that we've got. And we could do it in a Trello card directly. That's okay. So if we had an item has which attributes or properties? A name. Yeah, so it's going to be like latte or scone or tea. What else does it have? A price. So quantity isn't, this is where it gets tricky, because quantity isn't an attribute of the item. It's not an attribute of the item. What is it an attribute of? Yeah. Who said that? Yeah, order. The order, right? Quantity is an attribute of the order. So an order consists of items with quantities, doesn't it? So yes, Jai.
If we were like go into depth into like the different sizes of a latte, that there would be an attribute.
Yeah, there could be. There could be. So for for more, that's really good thinking, Jai. So for a different set of requirements, where we had multiple sizes of drinks, for example, then we would have a different price associated with each one, and we would have to have the size attribute. For our item, but our requirements don't call for that, so we won't worry about that. Let's look at our user stories again. Yeah, what about this user story? What piece of information do we need to be able to implement that user story? How much they cost. So not just the price, but the cost, yeah? So back here in my item class, I'm going to say, okay, we also need a cost. So we need a name, a price, and a cost. Those are the attributes for our item. Yeah? Now, it isn't clear to me at this point that our item itself has any behavior. Anything we need to do to it or that it needs to do itself. Okay? So let's think about the other class that we just thought of that's involved in this problem, which is the order. Yeah? So let's write a card for implement the order. So let's look at the order. Order properties, attributes. Okay, what attributes does an order have? It has a list of items, doesn't it? So it has a... So it could be a hash. Yes, it could be a hash of items and quantities, right? And that would be a fine way to implement it. So somehow we have to have a list of items and how many of each one makes up this order. Yeah? So does our order have any other attributes that we need to keep track of besides just the items in the order? Probably not, but there are some methods though. So some actions or behaviors. So there are things like, what are some things that we need to know about the order? We need to be able to add to the order, add items. What else? What was that? Total profit? Yeah. Oops. I don't know what just happened there. Total profit, total price, right? And again, we look back at our user stories to be informed about what we need to do with our order. So we can list the products on the menu. Well, that's not really related to order. That's something else, isn't it? We haven't gotten there yet. We can ask the user for their order. So we're going to be adding to the order, right? So that's our add order method. They can order an item on the menu, specify a quantity. That's also add order. So these two are really related. Can print the customer's order and the total price. So we probably need like a print order too, don't we? Can we think of anything else that we'll need to do with this order? We do have total profit.
Do you need total items? Individual profit?
We might need to see total items, but if we think about the user stories, it's probably in the printing of the order is the only place that's relevant, right? We may have some helper methods that come out of this, but at this level we're thinking about what is sort of the actions that we expect to either perform on our order or that we expect our order to be able to perform. One of those two things. So it may be that while we're implementing these methods, there's a need for some helper methods. Something that we have to do, for 2 different cases or something to make our code more modular and testable. But right now we're just sort of thinking at a higher level, what are the things that we can do with our order? I think that's a pretty good list. We may come up with other things later, but looking at our user stories, I can't really see a need for something else.
It would be a good idea to have a sequence generator to generate a unique order ID for every order, please.
We could. So I think if our app requirements were a bit bigger, for example, if we had multiple customers or multiple orders for a single customer or something like that, if there was a case where we had multiple orders, then we would probably want some way to uniquely identify an order. But since our requirements are that we only are dealing with one customer and one order, then it's not really a requirement here. But we might, though, say in our documentation, we might note things like future extensions. I think that's probably something we have to put in the README, future extensions of this product. then we might want to note that there as we're thinking through. So in future extensions, we might say, so this is going to be a list of ways to extend the app in a future release. And so we might say, add ability to serve multiple customers and have multiple orders. And we can make a note that this would require modeling the customer object and giving orders a unique ID. You know, so we make notes of what we would have to do to be able to provide that extension. And the reason we do that is because when we write our code, even though we're writing something for more limited requirements, we don't want to paint ourselves into a corner. We don't want to make it difficult for us to add those things. Okay? So by creating an order class, we're already making it easier to add this extension, because we just have to add another attribute to our order, right? And then we would have to take that attribute into consideration in our methods. But just by modularizing our solution to the point of having orders separated from the main program, that makes it easier to do that extension. Do you have a question, Aiden? So that's something else we could do as a future extension. It's not in our requirements, but it's something that we could put as a future extension. So add ability to remove items from an order. And this would require having a remove item method in the order class that updates the hash of items. Yeah? So as you're working on your terminal app assessment and you're brainstorming your ideas and you're nailing down your user stories and working on your estimates and figuring out, okay, what do we actually have time to do in 2 days, and getting those stories prioritized, you'll think of other things that would be really cool to do, all right? And then document them. Document those things that you would like to do but probably won't make it into this iteration. Yeah?
Well, you have talked about those today, like what's viable to days and what's good ideas.
Yeah, so we'll talk more about that on Wednesday, because on Wednesday I'm going to share the rubric and we'll talk through the rubric together. The rubric, when you're doing an assessment for a class that's being marked because you get a diploma out of the class, so you have to match that you met the learning outcomes, then your priority needs to be making sure that you meet the requirements of the rubric. Now you have to trust us that what we put in the rubric are useful things, that if you write an app that does those things, and we're leading you in the right direction to write good apps, okay? But we are going to assess your project on the criteria in that rubric, and that is what's going to dictate for you what's in your MVP. Just like I mentioned this morning, the rubric is broken up into this is what you need to pass for each criteria, this is for a credit, for distinction, for high distinction, okay? And then you look at those rubric criteria and you decide, okay, this is where, you know, this is what I'm going to be happy with for my result. Now, I'll tell you that typically it's unreasonable to try to get HD for every criteria. That's why it's HD. So yes, it's possible, it's attainable, but for most people, it's more than you're going to have time to do or want to do in the time that you've got, okay? So depending on your personality, I certainly had a personality when I was in school that I would kill myself rather than go for less than HD. That is not the way that I suggest that you be, because it did not make me a happy individual. So know that the real point of doing this assessment is to get as much learning out of it as you can. That is the point of doing the assessment. That's the point of everything you're doing in this course, is to learn as much as you can from the experience, okay? So don't get hung up on the marks. I'm confident that everyone will pass, and that most of you will do much better than passing, okay? So to get the diploma, you just need to pass. And you shouldn't be focused on the marks, you should be focused on the learning opportunity that's there, okay? So keep focusing on that. But use the rubric criteria as a guide to what you should be learning, all right? And where you see that there's a gap for you, then that's a place to look for where there's an opportunity to learn something else. And if you feel like you need help with that, you need more support to learn that thing, then come to me. You can turn to your classmates too, but if you're not finding it yourself, then come to me and we'll address it together, okay? But that's the whole point of doing this, is to learn what you need to learn. Okay, so we might think of other things that could be future extensions. Now, these future extensions, you could create separate cards for them if you wanted to, and they could just be a part of your backlog. Or you could, however you want to document it, don't get too hung up on the particulars about how you put things in this board. You just want to make sure that how you're doing it makes sense to you and your partner, okay? That it's clear what you're documenting and how you're using it, and that's all that matters. Okay, so instead of implement class methods here, we've got some more definition about and this, I'm going to move this in because we're doing this now. We're defining classes with attributes. And now we can talk about, we haven't written the code for this yet, so we're not going to check these off yet, but we've defined what classes we need. Do we need any other classes? So there's one other player in this, but I don't know that we need a class for it. So we have the items, we have the order, and then we sort of have the cafe, you know? The cafe itself. And the cafe is the thing that interacts with the customer, you know, that asks the customer, that shows the menu, that creates the order, that adds the items to the order, that prints the order at the end, that prints the total price and the total profit. That's the cafe, the app itself, that's doing all those things. Now, this is a matter of preference. You could create a cafe class and instantiate that cafe class. But for me, it's just as good, because this really is a specialized application. This cafe is an application itself, right? It's not, when I create classes, it's things that I want, that I may reuse in some other way. So you can see how if I define an item class, I could use that for all sorts of things, not just cafes. There are lots of things that have items with names, price, and cost, right? Lots of applications that can use that. So I could reuse that item class for a restaurant, or for, you know, the movies, or for like all kinds of things, right? For a music store, for a library, for like, you know, all sorts of things potentially. And an order is also something that's quite reusable, isn't it? So if an order is just a collection of items, well, that also can be used pretty much for any two-sided marketplace, couldn't it? So it's not specific to any one application. That's what I use to determine what should be represented as a class versus what is just sort of an application, you know, that I just code in my main application file. So when I'm doing something specific, when I have a specific use case, like a cafe, that with these specific requirements that takes one order from one customer, that's very specific, right? Then I would just represent that as a program. So that would be kind of like my main program that makes use of these classes that I've created. All right? So that's how I would choose to define it. You could probably make some arguments for defining some reusable cafe class that is generalized, that you use in some specific way. All right? But for given the requirements we have, I would choose to represent the cafe as the app itself would represent the cafe. Okay? So I would, for example, have, I'm going to put this as a comment. So we're going to have an item class, which represents an item with a name, cost, and price. and an order class. And then maybe I put in parentheses here, this will be called item.rb. An order class, which will be called order.rb. And it represents an order for one customer with a collection of items and quantities represented as a hash. And then I'll have cafe.rb, which is the main application representing the cafe itself. This is what shows the menu and asks the user, customer, for their order and creates the order and prints the summary with total price. Can also print the total profit. So for me, those are the three files that we're going to need. An item RB, order RB, and a cafe RB. All right. So now I might define item class. Let's just try to do that now together. So let's go to code. Okay, so we could decide to put our classes in a subdirectory. We'll do that. I'll create a subdirectory called classes. And in classes, what two files do I need?
Order RB and item RB.
Okay, so item is the simpler of those two, right? If we look back at our Trello card and see what we saw needed to be in each one of those, while order only has one attribute, it's going to have a bunch of methods. So let's do item first. So how do we start defining item RB? Not def, but we're defining a class. Yeah? Yeah? Okay. Now, what did we say we need in here?
At 9.
So where should we define these things? And we're going to have, in here we said we need an at name, an at what? Price, and a cost. Now, how are we going to get this information into item? That's the next question we have to answer. It's probably reasonable to think that when we create an item, we provide that information. Yeah? So we'll pass that in as parameters. So name, price, cost, and then how will we initialize them inside of this method? Yeah? And price equals price, and cost equals cost. Now it isn't clear at this point that we need to expose any of these attributes outside of this class. It isn't clear at this point that we need to do that, but we may need to. So we'll leave it for the moment, and then when we define our order class, it will start to become clear if we need to. And that's the approach that I suggest that you take, and not just automatically give everybody access to everything. Wait and see what you need, and then add the access as you need it. Okay? Now, at the risk of being too confusing, we could use subclassing here to define different types of items. So we have a choice here. We could say that our cafe is responsible for creating items with the correct price and cost, and that would be justified, because who's going to determine the price and cost of items? The cafe will, right? That's up to the cafe. So we could, outside of this classes directory, we know we're going to need a cafe.rb, right? That should be outside of classes. Yeah. So we could, in our cafe RB, we could define some subclasses of item in order to define that price and cost.
I was
Yes.
doing the required yesterday, and it wouldn't be required relative, even though it was in the same way here. I was just going down into the methods / process directories I had made.
Right? And what was happening?
It was giving me errors, and I didn't.
It'll be something, if we looked at the error, we could sort it out. Okay, so I can look at that with you. So let's go back to this in a moment, talking about items. Let's go to our order class and think about what we need there. So how do we find the order class? Yep. And what did we say is the attribute that our order has? It has a list of items. We can call it order, or we can call it items. What do we want to call it? Do we want to call it order because it's got quantities too? Okay, so we can call it order. And what kind of data structure did we say it would be? And how should we initialize it? Initially it would be empty, wouldn't it? Because initially nobody's ordered anything. Do we? So that's something to think about. So you think about, how am I going to interact with this order? So we mentioned that we're going to need an add order method, right? Because you think about, how do we create an order? We're going to say to the customer, here's the things you can order. What do you want? And they're going to order one thing at a time, right? So it's not going to be like we have a whole order and then we create it. We're going to create this order as the customer's giving us input. And to start with, there's nothing in it. They haven't ordered anything. So to start with, we have an empty hash. Does that make sense?
It also says that we will then be looking at orders. So how would we do that?
That was in part 1. So we could take care of that with... It doesn't need to be... It does need to be an array of hashes. No, it doesn't need to be an array of hashes. If it's a hash where the item, so let's put a comment, order, no, it does need to be, does it? No, I'm not sure.
Hash with an item as the key and the value.
Yeah, is a hash where the item is the key and is the value.
I was going to say, this is probably one of those situations where it makes sense to use the hash with using a 0 as a default value, so you can just do a +1 on it when you're adding to the order.
But
saves a little bit of
you could, but then you have to deal with the processing of, if there are things listed with 0, then you have to handle that you don't print those things.
Nothing should be listed with 0. If you're just using add order to add an item to it, it should add the item and then plus whatever the quantity was. So there shouldn't be any entries with 0 if you actually add a 1 to it.
I'm still not following you, because what I'm hearing is that you would initialize this hash with 0 quantities for all possible items. No?
It just means when you define an entry.
So that's how I've done it. Hash new, and then when you just go plus, so you can just do a plus equals 1. And
But what do you plus equals 1 to, though?
so it just means when I create that key,
Right.
it will automatically assign it with 0. So then I can go plus equals.
Right.
And it just saves that extra having
Okay.
to check if the key exists.
All right. Okay, so that's nice. So what Isaac is saying is that if you instantiate hash.new with this syntax, and let's look it up. So if we instantiate it with a 0, let's see if this tells us enough to see that.
Hash.new tags the default value for the hash.
Stores the default value inside the newly created hash.
Look at the stack I don't know, they usually pretty good.
It's not really with default keys though in this
No, It
case.
just means that when you create a new key value pair,
Hmm.
you assign the value to whatever that default is, and then so pretty much like as you saw when I
Mhm.
that key, you create a new key, and then I can just add directly to it.
Add directly
Put
to it,
default
yeah.
to 0.
So I think it's for like counting the all groups, something like that.
Uh-huh.
So when you create a new key, assign the default value to it. So in this case, you assign 0, so just say everything starts with 0.
So the values are 0.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
the alternative is you would have to. And
You'd have to
although
check,
ternary is
yeah.
nice, but you would
Yeah.
have to say, does this key exist? If so, add 1. Otherwise, assign it 0.
Right, right. So yeah, it says right here, if no default is set, nil is used. So if you create, yeah, that's right. So if you create a new key, then automatically the value assigned to that key is nil, and you can't increment nil. So that's where you would have to set it explicitly to 1 in the case that it isn't already in there. And if it is in there, you would have to do something different. You'd have to increment the value that's there. So to avoid having that if case, that extra if case, if we initialize hash with hash.new and give it a 0 default, that means that by default, if we add a new key, the value associated with that key is 0. And since what we're tracking are integer quantities as values in this hash, then that's a good choice. Is that really confusing for people? Is it somewhat clear?
How do you find that the indexes are 0?
Say again?
Using the indexes at 0?
No. So this is related to the default value assigned when we access a new key. So how do we access values in a hash? We do it using the key, right? So we say hash name, square brackets, key, and that's how we access a value. So by default, if we try to access a value with a key that isn't yet in the hash, then the value associated with that key is nil. Okay? So we can't say, if what we're keeping track of in our hash here,
It may be easier to explain after if you have like once you implemented add method.
yeah, that's probably true. So we can revisit it after we do that. So somebody look at the Trello card and tell me what methods we said we needed. Add item. We'll think about what these need in a minute. What else? What else is in the card?
It just says that
No, it should say more than that.
So that's in the aura. The actual aura.
Yeah, if you look in the order, so here in define classes, yeah, where did we put that? I can't remember now. Oh yeah, here, implement order class. I'm going to move these over. All right, implement order class. So total profit, total price, print order. price, total profit, print order. Now, what could we do instead of a print order method?
2S.
Yeah, we could override 2S, and then we could just say puts order. Does everybody remember us doing that? And some other examples? Yeah? Aiden? How would you use modules?
Well, you have total profit, total price, and all that stuff. They kind of just related to each other, so why not just have a module?
So a module is where we have more than one class that have some behavior in common, but not all. It's typically related to subclasses of a class that have some related behavior that's not shared by all subclasses of that class. That's when modules are appropriate. So here, though, it could be appropriate possibly is a helper method. So we'll work that out as we go along. It's possible that having a helper method would be useful. Yeah, right? So yeah, modules in JavaScript are different than modules in Ruby. So modules in Ruby are a way of defining common behavior between subclasses that's not shared by all subclasses. That's what modules are used for in Ruby, like interfaces in Java.
Like swimming or something.
Hmm?
Like the swimming example?
Like the swimming example, exactly. So we have these different subclasses of animal, like dog, cat, bird, fish. All of those, it's appropriate that they subclass animal because they're all animals. But only some of them can swim. So it doesn't make sense to define swim in animal because not all animals can swim. But it would be repeated code if we define swim in only the subclasses where the animals swim. Then we'd have to define it in fish and in alligator or crocodile or whatever, right? And shark, all these different kinds of animals. So we can define it in a module called swims or swimmable. And then the subclasses that can swim would include that module. So it's just a way to share behavior.
The classes are IM where modules are undo.
That's right. That's right. So here, our add item is going to need some information, isn't it? So this is where we get into what information do we keep track of here and what information do we keep track of in Cafe. Because to add an item, we need to create an item. Yes? So at some point in order, we're going to have to say item.new. And we're going to have to pass it some information, aren't we?
I would argue that you want to define your items outside of the order, probably in Cafe itself.
In Cafe itself, because Cafe is the one that knows about price and cost, isn't it?
Pass the reference to the item into the order.
Exactly. Exactly. So instead of trying to create the item in order, because order doesn't know anything about price and cost. An order is just a collection of items and quantities. That's all it is, right? Who knows about price and cost? The Cafe knows about price and cost. So it's up to the Cafe to create the items with a price and a cost. So when the Cafe calls to the order to add an order, it's just going to pass it an item it's already created. So we'll pass an item and what else? A quantity. Because those are the two things we need to know for an order, isn't it? An item and a quantity. Now, how are we going to add that item to our hash?
Order.
So we're going to have to do something with order, aren't we? And what do we want to do? So this is the case where if we didn't default 0, we would have to pay attention to, is this the first time I'm adding this item? Has this item already been ordered? Am I just incrementing the quantity on something that's already been ordered? Or is this the first time this item has been ordered and it doesn't exist in my hash yet? But since we use the default 0 in the instantiation of our hash, what that means is we can say order of item plus equals what? Quantity. We can just add the quantity to the hash value for that item. Now, the only reason we can do that again is because we initialized it with 0. If we hadn't initialized it with 0, then it would be nil by default, and we couldn't say plus equals quantity because you can't add to nil. We would have to have an if statement here that said if order has key item, then add quantity, else order of item equals quantity. Okay? So it saves us that conditional statement by using the 0 default with hash.new. Okay? Does that make sense? Kind of? It's totally fine to do it the other way if this is uncomfortable, if it feels, if you feel unsure about it. There's nothing wrong with instead saying if order key item order item quantity else stop it order item equals quantity. Okay, that's the alternative. Does that make sense? All right, and that's what we'd have to do if we did it this way. Say again? You can add any of them. So our add item's taking care of it for us. So we can add any item with this add item. It's not specific. It's going to let us add any item with any quantity. And our logic inside of this method, that plus equals, is taking care of the case of if this item's already defined in my hash or not. Okay, so that we're taking care of that.
Isn't it when you need to pull it again to add in a different paragraph for a different item?
Well, we will, but that's how our program's going to work anyway, because we're going to ask the user, the customer, for one item at a time. We're not going to ask them for multiple items at once. We're going to ask them for an item in quantity, and every time they tell us an item in quantity, we're going to call add order with that item in quantity, right? And in this way, we're going to build up an order. And that's really all the code we need in that method. It's quite simple, isn't it?
Probably want to return self, just as a best practice being able to chain methods. So.
We could. It doesn't hurt to. Okay, so who can tell me besides Isaac why we'd want to return self?
So that it keeps a hold of the information.
So by returning self, what does it allow us to do? So we could call add item, add item, add item, add item on the same order if we return self. Now we don't actually play, that probably doesn't make sense for this particular implementation, but because this order class is generic and we may want to use it in another application, then it's nice to return self here, because otherwise we're really not using the return value, are we? It's just sort of a throwaway. And so a useful thing that we can return from this method is self, to allow us to call add item again if we wanted to, or to call total price after. We could call add item and then call total price directly on the result, right? Or total profit, or 2S, right? If we return ourselves, then we're free to do that. Okay, what about total price? What would we have to do here? So our item is going to store price, isn't it? Our item stores price. We have an item in our hash. That item is actually an item object. It's not just a string. It's a whole item object with all of that information. Okay? We haven't done the work in Cafe yet to create those items, but we're going to assume that's going to happen. And what comes into order is an item. It's one of these things with a name, a price, and a cost. Yeah? So if we assume that that's true, then what do we have to do to calculate the total price?
Firstly, make the price accessible.
We will, won't we? Because we're going to have to, at some point here, we're going to have to loop through the items and we're going to say item.price, right? To add up the prices, which means we need to make price readable. Yeah? So let's do that. So, how do we... Are we going to have to iterate through this hash? We're going to have to iterate through the hash, aren't we? To add up all the prices of all the items. Yeah? And we need a handle on both the key and the value, because the key is the item. That's where we're going to get the price from. And the value in this hash is the quantity. And we're going to have to multiply the price by the quantity, aren't we? And we're going to have to accumulate the sum. Yes? So we're going to have a variable that stores that sum so we can accumulate it in the loop. Yes? So let's create a variable, maybe just called total. And what should we initialize it to? What's a reasonable variable value to initialize a total to? 0. Because before we start iterating through this hash, they don't know anything. The hash could be empty. Maybe they didn't order anything. That's possible. They could just quit. And the first time we asked them, couldn't they? And then when we print the total order, they didn't order anything, and the cost is 0. So that sets us up for that. At the end of this method, we're going to have to return the total. That's pretty clear, right? That's what this total price does. So we could add a note here that says returns the total price for order. Yeah? Now, how do we want to loop through our order hash? Considering we need both the key and the value.
So just order.each.
Uh-huh.
Key, comma, and value.
Yep, and I'm going to call it item, comma, quantity, just to make it more clear what those things are storing. Okay, but key and value is fine too. And what do we want to do inside of here?
Well, item equals, maybe? No.
Not item equals. What do we need to do in here? So now we have the item, which has 3 pieces of information on it. Name, price, and cost. And we agreed that the piece of information we need for this purpose is price. And so we made it readable from our item class. Right? So what are we going to do with each price? Yeah, so we're going to say item.price times quantity. And then what do we want to do with that value? Add it to total, yes? Does that make sense? So for each item, we get the price, multiply it by quantity, and add that to our total. And then we return the total. and we're done. There's just not much to it, is there? When you start thinking about it, you're like, oh, how do I do this? I'm not really sure. But then if you just take it one little piece at a time, and it takes practice recognizing patterns. Okay, so let's do, for total profit, what would our total profit be? Total profit is what? Total price minus total cost, isn't it?
Yeah, you haven't done total cost.
So we probably need a total cost method, don't we? And this is going to return the total cost for order. And what am I going to have to do in here?
Set the total.
Yeah, and that's what I'm going to return, isn't it? And I'm going to have to do something very similar, aren't I? So I'm going to have to go through order, yeah? But this time, what am I going to add up? Yes, so what am I going to have to do to be able to do that? Yeah, I'm going to have to make it readable. That's right. Where do I make it readable? In item. So I need to go back to item and also make cost readable so I can access it from order. Now what does total profit need to do?
Well, it needs to,
It's pretty simple what it needs to do at this point, isn't it?
you know, it needs to take the total cost away from the total cost.
Mm-hmm. And I can just use those two methods, can't I? So I can just return total price minus total costs. That's all right. Yeah.
Order's doing a bit of the heavy lifting for item there. That's
Well-
what I would say item should be responsible for determining the profit, and order should be able to query that from item.
We could, but that would be a slightly different model because item doesn't keep track of quantity.
No, but you could pretty much, instead of iterating through to get the total cost, you could just pretty much do the exact same as what you've done for total price, except just grab the profit from the item. That way order doesn't even need to know what cost is.
We could. I mean, order doesn't know what total. It does know what total cost is, I guess, but it doesn't. It's getting that information from item as it is. So it's really just shifting where the implementation is, which we could do. So you're saying that if we.
I'd be having an item essentially have a method called profit, just simply returns the price minus the cost. And then you could essentially just run the same thing,
but then you're still going to have to get so if we didn't care about total cost, so if there was no requirement that said I need to just get the cost of an order, but you probably could argue if you need to know profit that you also maybe want to get the total cost of an order as the cafe. Do you know what I mean? So I think it's useful to have a total cost method available.
More in terms of extensibility, if down the track for some reason you needed to get the actual profit for an item, it makes more sense to then have item be able to return its profit individually rather than just have an order being the one that... You could. So item knows its price and cost. So we could have a method on item called profit. And profit would do what? What would profit do? For a single item, what's profit?
What's the item price? at price minus at cost.
Yeah. And that would be the profit for one item.
So you have to put that in your cart.
Mm-hmm. I keep wanting to write profile. And then we could get rid of this, is what Isaac is suggesting here. Okay?
But how will it still total it though?
Because what it could do instead here is we could get the profit for each item and multiply it by the quantity. Right? So for each item, add up profit. So obviously I had a job where I typed profile a lot, and so every time I type PROFI, my fingers want to type LE every time. Yeah. Okay, so this would just be another each loop, wouldn't it?
Are we doing this one?
It's an alternative. You can leave what you've got if you want. Okay, so I'm just going to demonstrate the alternative. So again, we'd have item and quantity. And we'd have to have a variable total that we set to 0. And inside of here, it'd be very similar. What do we do here? So here we're getting the profit for each item using our new profit method. What would we do?
What did you call it? Profit item.
So in item, it's just a method called profit.
Okay.
So what would we do?
So did it have a? You have to call that, don't you?
Yep, we're going to have to call item.profit, and we're still going to multiply it by quantity, right? Because we'll make that profit on each item. Yeah? And just as before, we're going to sum up that. We're going to accumulate that profit into the total and return the total. So it's just taking the profit for each item, and then we don't need this method anymore, is the point that Isaac was making.
Also, you can,
And we also can get rid of this. Okay, and that's just an implementation choice. And the points that you're making are valid, that it makes item perhaps more useful as a generic object because an item's the one that knows its own price and cost. And so it's the one that knows its profit, and we can just ask it for its profit instead of leaving it up to order to do that. And then some other use of the item object outside of order may find it useful to be able to get the profit, you know. So it's just an implementation choice, and I would be happy with either one of those choices. I think you could say that either one of those, you know, is an appropriate choice for this particular use case, right? And I would be happy with either one. Okay, so let's try to implement our printing method, which is our 2S method. Now this method is responsible for giving us nice readable output about our order. So we're going to list the quantity and things in our order, and we can also include a total price in there if we want to, right? So how do we want, so remember that 2S doesn't print anything, it returns a string, okay? And one thing that we'll want is this to be multi-lined output. We don't want it to all come out on one line because that would be really hard to read, right? If they ordered a bunch of stuff, that would be hard to read. So we can use new lines to make multi-line output. Alternatively, if this all feels too hard, we could just define a print order method, and we could call that print order method, and it just does puts. Okay? Either one is fine. Which one do you prefer that I do right now? The one with puts?
Yeah.
Okay. The one with puts, so a print order. Well, you know how to do it with the 2S, so we'll look at the print order method, and then you can choose to do whatever you want. The only difference between this and implementing a 2S is 2S will return the string, print order will print the strings, okay? So we would have a puts, something like,
Store ordering.
yeah,
And one new line.
well, if we use puts, we don't have to put the new line, right?
Right.
So that's the benefit of doing it this way, is you don't have to worry about that pesky new line character. It's not a big deal, okay? I can show you how to do it the other way. But, okay, so then we might want to say, we might want to have a little bit of a little fancy little separator like that. And then we might want to put an empty puts above here so that there's a space above what we print out here, because we just had some user input. And now what are we going to have to do in order to print their order? What are we going to have to do?
You're right.
Yeah, we're going to have to iterate. And just like we've done 3 times already, although we deleted one of them, we're going to do it exactly the same way. So we'll have order.each do item quantity, and inside of that loop, what are we going to do?
Well, so we want to have the quantity first.
Yeah, we're just going to print something, right? So we're going to start with the puts. And I think it makes sense to start with the quantity. We'll use some string interpolation for that, right? So that's going to put a number. And then what do we want to put next to the number?
Or a dash.
A dash? We can put a dash. Yeah. And then what?
Item administrator.
Item dot what?
Next.
Now what does that mean we have to do?
You need name and item.
We do. We're going to have to make name readable in order to print name, aren't we? From order.
We'll add capitalized to it.
We could. Sure, I like that idea. Now that's going to print each item in quantity.
Pop that inside the curly brace.
Oh, yeah, you do. Thanks, Isaac. And then if we wanted to print the total at the end, maybe we put another fancy little formatter here. We could say your total is, and then what will we put in here?
At order total.
We don't need to refer to at order. We're in order.
Okay.
So what gives us our total price?
Total profit.
Not total profit, because we're trying to print the total price for the customer.
Total
Yeah?
price though.
It's just total price, isn't it? We already have a method for that. Now, if we want to format it, let's leave it like this for now. That's another card anyway. So we've got an implementation here for order. And that's a pretty complete implementation that we've got here. And we don't know if any of this works yet, do we? So this is where, if you were doing this properly, you would have written test first, and you would have tested it every time you add a method to make sure that those methods return what we expect. Okay? So because we're not doing automated testing yet, that makes it a little bit challenging. But what we could do, a way that you can do manual testing, is you can add some tests right here in your order class. You could do that, and then we could test things. So for example, we could say test order equals order.new, And we could say test order dot add item. Item dot new. There's something we still have to do though that we haven't done if we're going to do this. We'll get there. Item dot new. Latte. Look at our item class. What does our new expect?
Name, cost, and
Price and then cost in that order. What was the price of a latte? I can't remember.
$4.
4. And what was the cost?
$2.
2. And here's where it's handy to do this. Oh, what else do we need to do? An add item. We need to pass something else. A new item and a quantity. Let's say 2 lattes. And we'll have scone. Oh, how much was a scone?
$5.
And how much did it cost?
$3.
3. And then we'll have one of those. Okay, let's just do that.
Well, if you're getting 2 lattes, don't you want 2 scones?
Maybe we're sharing. We're sharing a scone
How
because
big the scone is?
yeah,
Yeah,
we're,
maybe you get 2,
we're watching
maybe you
our
don't.
we're watching our figure. Yeah.
This is where maybe have to start with this essentially, but this is where it would be helpful if you have a as you alluded to, like a catalog, or have the items one cafe, so you pass the references to one item instead of constantly have to, like if you were to add another latte after that, you'd have to create a new one.
You would. Yeah.
Maybe the item will get over what the app requires, but it's
So are you talking about
essentially have your items all predefined.
predefined as subclasses? Yeah.
And then you can
And that's what I would do. That's what I would do. And we'll go there. We'll go there. But for now, we're just talking about how can we quickly test. We write a class like this. We haven't written all the rest of our implementation yet. In order to test this, if we wanted to test it using our app, we'd have to go write our whole app too now, wouldn't we? All of our user interaction and everything else. And by the time we get done with all that, who knows what bugs we put in there. It could be full of bugs all over the place. At this point, we've written a very simple item class with 3 attributes and 1 method. And we've written a fairly complex order class. Our order class does everything our order class needs to do. I would not want to go write my cafe app until I have tested these 2 pieces to make sure they work the way I expect them to. Okay? So we could say, we could add some comments. We could comment all of this out in our final submission and say, for now, this would be suitable. Okay, once we learn about automated testing, you would do it a different way. But until we learn about automated testing and we have separate test files, this is okay. So we say testing for item and order class here. Okay, so first we can create items and add them to an order. That's what we're testing with this, right? And if this doesn't throw any exceptions, well, that's part of the way there. We know, at least we haven't introduced, that kind of bug. Now, in order for us to test this way, though, I'm using item.new. What am I going to have to do to be able to use that? Can somebody tell me? I'll try to run it if not, if you can't tell me.
Is that declaring that the item is in the, it's calling the item class?
Yeah, so if we're using the item class, we're going to have to require it, aren't we? And it's in the same directory that I'm in, yeah? So we could be explicit and say /item if we want to. Doesn't hurt. Now, I would also put a comment here for myself. Require for testing. I wonder if we need it otherwise.
Because we
Because we're not saying item.new.
We've been weird with its required. It seems like you require it somewhere in your.
Yeah.
It just seems to be then required everywhere. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I'm not either.
So I left it in just
Yeah.
to cover myself.
Yep. Okay, we'll see. We'll see what happens if we take it out at the end, if it complains. Okay, so let's go here and let's run. What am I going to run to test this?
You have to run you have to run item.
Order, because that's where I put my test code. So I'm in order RB,
Oh.
and that's where my test code is, right? Okay, no errors. That's a good sign. But it doesn't tell me anything, does it? No. So I could just call print order. Okay. But I could also check total price, total profit if I wanted to, couldn't I? But it seems faster, doesn't it, to call just print order. So now if I run it again, oh no! What happened? Oh, I know what happened. I bet I didn't save item. That's what happened. Okay, so see this error? What does this error tell me?
That it doesn't know about item
It doesn't know about what on item.
name.
It doesn't know about name, which implies that I haven't created an accessor for name. But we know I did, because it's right there. But I didn't save it. Okay? Now it's happy. So, 2 lattes, 1 scone, total is 13. So I can see from this that I'm not taking care of my decimal place thing, so that's something to note. I know that I've got a Trello card for that though, and I'm not working on that card right now. I'm working on the card to implement the order method, or the order class, and the item class. Okay? So, that appears to work. The only thing I haven't done is I should do the math. So when I would write this up in a test sheet, which we'll do tomorrow, I would write down, this is my test data, this is the expected result, and this is what I actually got. Because I'm taking for granted that 13 is right, that everything's happening correctly, but I should check that and make sure 13 is right. And I also probably want to put a $sign, don't I? Because that's what we expect to see. So I can fix that quickly and run it. Okay, at least now there's a $sign in front of it. That's good. Now I could, there's just one method I haven't,
got your item costs in.
there's one method I haven't tested in here, which is what? Yeah? Now in order to see it, what do I have to do? If I just call it, am I going to be able to see it? What is total profit to? It just returns a total. It doesn't print anything. So what can I do in order? Yeah. So let's run it again. Now I might want to put some words around it so I know what I'm putting. That would be good, wouldn't it? Seems about right. Again, I should work it out and see what the expected value is and make sure that what it's telling me is correct.
2, 4, 7, should it? 3. If it's $5 and $3, and each should cover is 2.
Yeah, I'd have to write it out. So now I can feel pretty confident about my order class and my item class, you know? So, I mean, your testing should probably be maybe a little bit more rigorous than this. Try some different values. what happens if you have an empty order. You know, does total profit and printing and everything work out okay? So we can test that now. We can say number 4, test with an empty order. So we can say empty order equals order.new, and then we'll just call empty order dot print order and puts total profit test empty order dot total profit. Okay, does everybody see what I'm doing there? I just want to make sure that things don't blow up.
Total profit is minute or something.
Well, it should say 0. But I just want to make sure that it doesn't blow up if I try to print an empty order or try to deal with an empty order, that it doesn't exception or tell me something weird that I don't expect, right? Or print things in a weird way. So let's try that. Okay, so if I have an empty order, it prints out like that. I can live with that for the moment. I can decide, okay, do I want it to format differently? If they haven't ordered anything, maybe I want to say you didn't order anything. I can decide that, but for the moment, functionally, I'm happy with this. It doesn't blow up if I have an empty order. I can still call print order. I can still call total profit, and there isn't a problem, okay? So now I can feel pretty good about going on with my cafe implementation. You know, feeling like, okay, my order class is solid, my item class is solid, they do what I want them to do. There's some little bits of enhancements that I have, you know, I have the Trello card for adding the 2 decimal places. I'll deal with that later. I'm happy that these 2 things are done and tested. Now I skipped ahead a bit because I did, you know, in the interest of time. So define classes with attributes, ready for review, implement class. So then I would push all of these up to GitHub, or if I'm working next to my partner, you could, for this app, maybe do some paired programming. I'll give details about that on Wednesday, okay, about what I expect, because I think we need to decide as a team still what we're going to expect. But it needs to be reviewed one way or another, okay, whether somebody's sitting next to you while you do it and offering review, or if you do some work on your own, you do some work separately, that you review each other's work, okay? And then testing, so then we tested, and you don't want to be the only one to test. You want to ask your partner to test it and make sure they see the same thing that you do. And when all the testing is done, then we can move it to done. So I just did that, not quite the way you would do it, because I got a little bit carried away talking through the example. We also did this bit. So we can look, sometimes this happens, okay? You create user stories, and then you implement them in other cards. So for example, we could, we haven't done this exactly, have we? Never mind, we haven't done this exactly. Because the cafe still needs to do this. The cafe is not doing it yet. We've just enabled the cafe to do it. So we still have to add code to cafe. So we might say the next thing that we would do is the first thing on our to-do list, right? So if I were done with that work and I were looking for next work, I would look at the top of the to-do list and say, okay, as a cafe, I can list products on the menu. All right? And that would be the thing that I worked on next. Now, I'm going to say, also, I'm going to add a card here. Actually, maybe I'll make it a sub-item here, perhaps. Because what I'm thinking is, where's Trello? Create subclass items for each menu item. So this is one way we could implement this. And if you're not comfortable with subclassing, you don't have to do this. But this is one choice that we could make. All right? So I'm going to move this to in progress. Now, right now, one choice that we have is from our cafe menu. we could say that when somebody orders an item, we're going to do item.new like we did in our order test, and we're going to pass in all those pieces of information each time. Another thing we could do is we could define subclasses of item in our cafe that represent our menu items. So we could, for example, say class latte extends item, and this would hold specific information about a latte. So I would have an initialize that wouldn't take any arguments, and what it would do is it would call super with latte, the price of a latte, and the cost of a latte. Now the benefit of this is that once I have code to add an item, I can do this. I can say, so I'm going to have an order defined in my cafe. And I can do something like order add item latte.new. And the quantity. Okay? Can you see how that's kind of nice? How that encapsulates the information about a latte, which this cafe knows about. This cafe knows that it has a latte menu item with that price and that cost. Does that make sense? The alternative is I'd have to do something like this. That's the alternative. Now, it's not a good idea to hard code things like these values, 4 and 2. Because now, any place in my code that I refer to those, I've got to change it in all those places. Right? If I change the price or I change the cost of a latte, then I've got to change all those things. But another thing that this does is it isolates those values to one place, which is also nice. And it just creates this sort of little extra bit of abstraction that allows us to refer to a latte. So this is just one choice. So what other subclasses would I have? I'm going to take this out for the moment because it's just there as an example. What other subclasses would I have for my menu? Which would also inherit from item. And what would it do? Right? What was this going again? 5 and 3?
5 and 4.
And then T. Yeah? So this is the part where I'm defining the cafe menu. Now I could do this in another file if I wanted to. I could have a file called menu.rb that I bring in here. if I wanted to modularize this a bit more. Okay, don't have to, but you could. And then you would just have to require a relative, that menu.rb. Okay? I would, in this case, stick them in one file rather than have a separate file for each one if this is all I plan to do with it. Okay? I wouldn't have a separate file for latte and a separate one for scone and a separate one for tea, because really it's the idea that these are my menu items. And it's kind of nice to have them in one file, I think. You know, so these are like decisions that you can make, that you have some freedom to make as a developer. You want to do what makes sense to you and what's going to make sense to other people looking at your code. So this is definitely going to have to require item, though. Now what I could do is, if I did define these in a separate file, could be a little bit nicer to read. So in classes, if I created menu.rb, and then I just grab this code that I just created and put it in menu.rb. So I just moved code from one place to another. Now this is going to have to, I'm pretty sure, I require item, because we're referring to item. Then in cafe, I can just menu, require the menu, which kind of makes more sense, right? From the cafe, it makes more sense semantically to require the menu.
So we're going to do it this way?
Yeah, let's do it this way. And we're also going to have to require order.
So what do we need to do in menu? Just paste
Menu, all I did was paste the subclasses, and then you have to require a relative item. I'll make all this code available to you later, okay? After we're done, I'll put it all out there. Okay, so now let's look back at our user stories. So, where did I put that here? Where did I just put that? Oh, here we go. So I've done that. That's done. Now, listing the products on the menu. Listing the products on the menu.
So that's displaying it to the customer.
Displaying it to the customer. Maybe with price, that's a choice that we can make. Probably makes sense. Generally, people want to know how much things cost.
just something that you don't want to do.
Yeah, it costs what it costs, man. You want a latte or not?
Ow.
So, listing the products on the menu. Where does this belong? I think it belongs in cafe. So we could have cafe. Now in cafe, we're going to have a way to list this. What's the best way to do that? So we could instantiate the items in the menu, and then we can call on them to tell us their price. We could allow each item to print itself. That's another thing we could do. And the choice between those is really not very significant particularly, unless we think that in general it's useful for an item to be able to print itself. We could have a 2S, couldn't we? Defined an item.
The thing is, currently all your items are in classes, aren't they? We haven't actually used intent yet.
No, we haven't. That's right.
That's where using a catalogue is handy because you can just get the catalogue to essentially give a list of items.
So tell me about your thoughts about a catalog.
Okay, so if you had a catalogue, you could essentially create an add item as a method in the catalogue. So you
Yes.
call that from cafe, so you can pretty much build your menu from the cafe. Then you can actually query the catalogue itself to return a list of the items that have been.
So you have a class, like a catalog class.
Yeah.
Okay, so what if instead of calling this menu, we have a menu class, and we could even define it inside of here. So we could have these things up top, and we could have a class menu.
Oh, you can.
Sure. You don't have to, because I'm going to push the code across. So it's ever easier for you to keep, to get the content from the lesson. If it's better for you just to watch and pay attention, then that's fine. I'll give you the code after.
You push up to GitHub.
Yeah, I'll push it out to GitHub.
You have some copy.
Hmm?
You send me a link.
I will absolutely. Okay, so we could have a menu class. Why does it keep doing that? That's really annoying. Stop.
Just have to press the stop.
Ah. Okay, so if we had a menu class,
So I actually use the hash sheet, so I could actually get the reference to my customer's string, the name of the item.
so you have an instance variable,
Yep.
like menu.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Items, so yeah, pretty much. That'll hold pretty much a string of the item name would be the key, and then the instance key item would be the value.
The name of the item's the key and the instance is the value.
Yeah.
So we could use just empty curlies probably in that case. Okay, so let's say menu is a hash with item.name as key and item as value. Yeah? And then we'll have an add item method. Yeah? And it's going to take 3 arguments. No, actually, all we need to do is have the name if we have these things defined up here.
So I actually passed it the item, because then in my cafe I just went add items in my item in there.
See, we could do this the way that we've got it right now. Oops. We could do this.
Anybody does a lookup then.
Hmm?
Anybody does a lookup then. You're going to need to access the class from the string. That string's not associated with the class.
That's true. That's
why I
true.
heard-
We'd have to do a lookup.
I actually passed a new item to it, and then I just pulled out the item.name and set the key.
Okay. So if we pass in an item, then we can say,
And menu, and then square brackets item.name,
yeah,
and then equals item.
yeah.
So it also have a get item as well. Then
Yeah.
you could query the string and get a reference to the item itself to pass back.
Stop it. So we pass in a string. And then we would return at menu of item name. Now the benefit of this, let's look at how we'd use it, and it'll probably make more sense. So we would have to initialize the menu. and we would say,
So you actually have to initialize the catalog first.
that's the menu. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah, so you have to go new menu.
yeah.
You
And
have to create an instance of the menu itself.
mm-hmm. I'm going to do that outside of here. And I'm going to pass that in here instead of making it a global variable. So down here in our main, I don't know.
Because I've just been using just local variables and been
I'm just noting it in comments. I don't know that it actually wraps it in a main.
Yeah, I just noticing how you do instance variables order a menu up there.
Oh yeah, there shouldn't be instance variables. Yeah, that was bad practice on my
Question where
part.
I've been doing what?
No, you're doing the right thing. Okay. So an initialized menu, we pass it a menu, and we'll say menu.add item, and then we'll say, we actually need to say, oh, just item.
Yeah,
It is just item, isn't it?
Yeah.
That makes
So you
sense.
can probably just throw latte new in.
Yeah, sure can.
That's where it's nice to also gets
Stop it. Okay, so now let's talk about what we're doing here. Okay, so what we've done is we have a menu and we have these menu items. So we have a latte, scone, and tea, and those things are responsible for keeping track of their price and cost, and they know their name. And then we have a menu class which represents what's on the menu. Okay? And so we initialize that as an empty hash, where that hash is going to hold the name of the thing, because that's what the customer's going to order, aren't they? The customer's going to order a latte, and they're going to give us a string that says latte. Or they're going to order a tea, and they're going to give us a string that says tea. So what this menu does, it gives us a mapping between the string that represents the item and the actual item, which has a price and a cost and a name. Okay? And that's going to allow us to have a really nice piece of code that just refers to what the customer is asking for, and then referring to that menu item as an abstracted thing in our cafe. Okay, and we'll see it as we flesh it out. But that's what we've done here. You can accomplish what we're doing here without doing all of this bit of abstraction that we're doing. But I think it's a good opportunity for us to demonstrate how these extra levels of abstraction with subclasses and classes allows us to create a really nice, clean, readable solution where the code's separated into separate files that then we could test separately, that we can reuse for more purposes, that we could update more easily, enhance more easily because the code's separated nicely. So we probably, this bit here is tying this implementation to the menu because I put these subclasses directly in here. And this is a place where some trade-offs come into play. So I could put these things in another file, cafe menu items, right? And because they're not really used here by menu. And then my cafe would include cafe menu items and a menu. Okay? So that could be valuable. I'm going to leave it the way it is right now because we're building a simple solution, but it's something that we could comment on. So just as we note it, recognizing that that's something, that's a choice that we're making, it's a good thing to note it. So I might just add something here. Separate cafe menu items definition from menu.rb. So menu.rb is more reusable. And to do that, no, it's not the right place. Where'd it go? I don't know what I just did. I clicked. Yeah, I know. I know. I think though that.
See this edit.
Oh, thanks. Okay. Put the subclasses into another file called cafe menu items.rb and require in cafe.rb. So I can make a note of it there, and I can choose to change to that implementation later if I want to. Right. Okay. So I initialize the menu.
Well, you got
Yeah.
initialize the menu, you're still calling use variable, use a parameter there. On the very bottom.
Oh yeah, thank you.
And going back to your what originally says down this part, one more method in the menu that's quite handy is you can dynamically list all the items in the menu.
Yeah, so we were just talking about printing the menu, weren't we?
Yeah,
And where does that belong? So now that we've defined a menu class, it seems pretty clear that the menu class should be responsible for printing itself. Right? So we could do this one with a 2S. Shall we? So in this case, we'll have a string.
What I did here,
Yeah?
I actually just grabbed the keys. Now you do hash.keys will give you an array of the keys.
Yeah?
And then join it with the new line character. It'll give you a nice list. Very succinct way to do that.
So if we just wanted to print the names without the
That's why I use
prices.
them as keys, so
Yes.
Bring out a list of keys.
Yeah.
Nice and easy like that.
Yeah. So we could do that for sure. We could do that. I'll do it slightly differently just to print the prices too. And you could probably also do that with a single line if you wanted to. We'll avoid trying to do that, and we'll just write it out. So if we said, I'm just going to create a variable. And I'm going to put a new line at the end of these, and I'm going to say menu string. Now, there are more elegant ways to do this, but I'm going to do it this way just because it's a perfectly reasonable way to do this, and you'll see stuff like this done a lot when we're formatting strings. So I'm going to add that new line just says print that, that string has a new line at the end of it. So when we call puts on this, what gets returned, this menu string that gets returned will have new lines in it, so it'll print nicely the way we want it to. Maybe we put some lines under there. And I'm just going to keep concatenating to this string. Now, here's where we have to go through our menu. So we could say at menu each do. We're just going to follow the same pattern we've been doing. Okay? So we're going to, in this case, we're going to have name item. That's what's stored in our hash. Remember, a hash with item name is the key and item is the value. We could just iterate through the values because we've got the name in there too. So we could do that, but we're just going to do this to follow the same pattern so we don't introduce too many new things at once. And so we'll, inside of there, we'll say menu string plus equals, so we can say what, the item, and then a dash in the price, or maybe just a tab in the price, or 2 tabs in the price.
The problem with the tabs.
It probably won't catch the tabs, will it? Yeah.
The problem is if you then punch in a longer name of item, that's what happens now.
Yeah.
And yeah, it just ends up indenting it over a little further than the rest.
It would. So, oh, we could put dots. I like dots. No, they probably won't line up is the thing, right? So what if we just put dashes and we not deal with the formatting at the moment? And you can play with string formatting if you want to later. And then we'll put item dot price, right? That's the other thing we want to print in here. Yeah, that's a good idea. And we still have this formatting issue, but we're going to leave it for the moment. The 2 decimal places. We're going to leave that for the moment. And then we're just going to return, oh, we have to put a new line at the end. And we'll return menu string. Now, I would want to test this. Yeah.
One hurt to throw the chomp on it, just get rid of that last new line that will be added to that last line.
It's a good idea. Although we might want a new line after we print it out. It probably doesn't hurt, does it?
So,
Yeah, it probably doesn't hurt. But we do have the expected behavior with puts that maybe it wouldn't have the new line at the end.
Because your other alternative would be to put the new line at the start of it and then remove the new line from the space that you got there.
We could. We could. We'll just do it this way though. So the chomp will remove that last new line just because our expected behavior when we say puts object is it wouldn't print an extra empty blank line. Whoever's using this puts can put an extra blank line if they want to. Okay? So let's add some testing in here. Test menu class. How can we test it? We'll instantiate a menu. Now our add item could return self, couldn't it? And that will allow us to do. Get item has to return the item. Yeah, but add item's not doing anything. It's not. We're not using the return on that. And if we return self, then we can call it in a chain for testing. So we can say, we could call it from a chain from our cafe too, but we won't. We'll keep it nice and separate. So we'll say add cafe items. So we're going to call menu add item latte.new dot add item t.new dot add item scone.new, and then we'll print the menu. And how do we print the menu considering we overrode 2s? Puts menu. Okay, let's see if this crashes and burns or if it works. How are we going to test it? What do I need to run? That's right. Oh, look at that. That's nice. Yeah? So, that's print menu done. It's another thing that we can take.
Just workflow wise, how do you, if you end up deciding I'm going to need another class here with it with menu, would you retrospectively
Add something?
to Trello?
What I would probably do is this. I would probably add just another subtask here. Create menu class to represent the cafe's menu. And then I might define it further here, like
See, that happens a lot when you're working on stuff and you think, this is really got to get split into another class here. It's more something that happens
Yeah.
when you're coding, not so much
It
when
is.
you're playing the code.
It is. That happens a lot. And you have to kind of balance between, so if you're working by yourself, it's one thing, right? You can kind of get away with that as long as you're disciplined about adding test cases and, or updating your existing test cases and that sort of thing. When you're working with a team, if you arbitrarily decide as you're implementing something, I think we need another class here, then you shouldn't just go at it.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering as far as like,
Yeah.
otherwise we can try that.
So if you're not working by yourself, at that point you should consult with your team, and say, hey, I think we should have another class here. Is everybody okay with me adding a class? You give them a little justification. You update documentation to indicate that this is being done. Maybe create another ticket or a card for it.
Yeah, I was going to say, would you then probably throw a card in just saying
You would.
discuss the possibility of
Yes, because a lot of times, your cards will be testable too. When you've are building an automated test, you would expect that every card, which represents a piece of implementing code, would have some testing associated with it, some tests that need to be written, and so that's a way to manage that for each piece of code that's being written. Yeah. So it would make sense in that case to add a card and make sure that the tests get added for that card and everything else. So if you have a workflow where the card moving through the steps, means that there are tests written for this and those tests have been executed and now we can move it to done. Yeah. So we've added this. We still aren't listing them from the cafe, so I don't know if we'll move that yet. And that's another argument, right, for having a separate card, because now we have a piece of work that's done and testable that could be reviewed and checked off. But if it's tied to this as a cafe, I can list the products on the menu. We haven't actually implemented in cafe.rb where we're calling puts menu, right? So that's another excuse. We might just add another card, and we can give it the same sort of ticket number and say, it's actually not a user story, so we won't do that. So we'll say add menu class to represent the cafe's menu. And so we have menu attributes, and we decided we have menu is a hash with this item name as key and item as value. And we'll go ahead and call this small because we just did it. Alright, and that card we can move to ready for review or testing. We've actually tested it already, so we'll move it to done. Right? And then we can leave this one in progress because we haven't done it yet. Alright, so I think we might stop there for today. And then tomorrow what we'll do is we'll start with a discussion of test-driven development. And we'll start to create a testing spreadsheet for this case that we're working through. And we'll write out some tests before we finish the development of it. So we'll include the tests that we've already written and executed, and we'll think about what tests do we need for Cafe to make sure that it works the way we expect it to. Alright, so that was a lot, but hopefully talking through that process and thinking through the abstraction and the way that we did it, hopefully that at least made some sense. Another thing that we'll do tomorrow in the morning, maybe before we get started on this, is we'll take another kind of small example and break it into user stories and classes, at least that initial step. And we'll practice that once or twice a week for a while, just to practice that process, because that's feedback I get is that's one of the hardest steps to take. Once you've decided this is the class I need and these are the attributes and these are the methods, That's one thing, right? And then implementing those methods depends more on your understanding of control structures, data structures, and that kind of thing, which also takes practice. But it's a different thing, isn't it? It's different. It's a different kind of activity, separating things into classes and what their attributes and methods are, and then implementing those methods are really two very different kinds of activities. So I think it's beneficial maybe to separate those two things and practice them independently a little bit. Yeah, does it sound good? Are there any questions about all the things that we've covered today with this example? Too many questions to ask?
I got lost up down and up again.
Did you, Chris? I know. Stop me if you get lost. And I'll slow down.
Also, I have one question, right? No, are we receiving the assignment this Wednesday?
Are we what? Sorry?
Receiving the assignment this Wednesday?
It won't be released until Tuesday next week.
Oh, okay.
But we will look at the rubric together on Wednesday.
Oh, yeah.
I'll assign teams on Wednesday. You'll have some time to brainstorm what you want to do. And I'll walk through the rubric so you'll know exactly what you're in for. Okay, we'll answer any questions about that, and I'll talk about how the things in this cafe example we've done would match to those rubric criteria. Okay? And hopefully that'll help to clear up what's expected for the assessment. Yeah, Aiden?
I'm only going to get
Yes. I saw a Slack message from Michelle that she had created one. She's probably waiting for me to look at it. Where is it? I don't know where it went. I'll find it and I'll send it to you guys, and then I'll just ask you to do it, tonight if you can, or tomorrow morning when you get in. It should be really short, really brief, to give me an idea. So we don't have any Canvas content. If anybody if your brain isn't too jiggly and you want to go over anything that we just did, then we can spend some time doing that. And otherwise, if you're like toasted for the day, understand that. That's okay. You can go try to absorb some of that. Maybe try to walk through some of the steps yourself. Maybe try to recreate without looking at what I've done. I'll put it up in GitHub, but maybe just trying to, do some of what we just did together is something that you could do without, immediately looking at what I put in GitHub. Yeah, Aiden. Yeah, so I'm just going to put it in our class GitHub. Does everybody, I'll show you that. So the one we created that we have Carly's cool application in, this one, I'll put the link in Slack. You should have access to it because I just added the whole team has access, so I'm going to GitHub for class, the example today. Will be there. Okay, so if you don't have access to that GitHub, let me know. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create see don't know if you can put. Okay, you can.